December 7, 1941, a Sunday evening at Chequers, the British Prime Minister's country residence. Winston Churchill was dining with American Ambassador John Winant and Averell Harriman, Roosevelt's special envoy. The radio was on, a small, unremarkable detail that was about to change everything. Somebody turned up the volume. A BBC broadcast cut through the dinner conversation. Japanese forces had attacked the American naval base at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. Multiple ships destroyed, hundreds, possibly thousands of American servicemen dead. The room went silent. What happened next has been described by multiple witnesses, and Churchill himself wrote about it at length in his memoirs. He stood up from the table, walked to another room, and called Franklin D. Roosevelt directly. The call was short. Roosevelt confirmed it was true, reportedly saying, "It's quite true, they have attacked us at Pearl Harbor. We are all in the same boat now." That wording comes primarily from Churchill's own memoir rather than a transcript, so it should be understood as Churchill's recollection of the exchange. Churchill later wrote that he felt certain, in that moment, that America would now enter the war. He told Roosevelt that Britain would move to declare war on Japan immediately, once the attacks on British territories were confirmed. Roosevelt acknowledged the constitutional process on the American side would take a little longer. Churchill said he understood. That phone call is where this story really begins, not just as a moment of military alliance, but as the culmination of 2 years of desperate British effort to bring America into a war that Churchill believed Britain could not win alone. To understand what Churchill felt that December evening, the word he used repeatedly was relief, which shocked many people at the time and continues to shock people today. You have to go back to where he started, back to May 1940, when Churchill became Prime Minister of a country that was, by most rational military assessment, losing the war. When Churchill took office on May 10, 1940, the same day Germany began its Western offensive, Britain's strategic situation was catastrophic. France was collapsing faster than anyone had predicted. The British Expeditionary Force was being pushed toward the coast. Within weeks, 338,000 Allied troops would be evacuated from Dunkirk, which Churchill himself called a colossal military disaster, despite the public mythology that grew around it. France surrendered on June 22, 1940. Britain now stood effectively alone against a Germany that controlled virtually all of continental Europe. Churchill's famous speeches from this period, "We shall fight on the beaches, their finest hour," were not just morale boosters, they were also addressed to an international audience, specifically to America. Churchill understood something fundamental about public rhetoric, that the right words, broadcast at the right moment, could shape political reality in a country across the Atlantic that was deeply divided about whether to get involved in yet another European war. The America of 1940 was not the America we imagine in retrospect. The isolationist movement was powerful, well-funded, and in many quarters genuinely popular. Charles Lindbergh, the most famous man in the country, was actively arguing that America should stay out. The America First Committee had hundreds of thousands of members. Congress had passed the Neutrality Acts specifically to prevent the kind of entanglement that had pulled America into the First World War. Roosevelt himself was constrained by this political reality. He was running for an unprecedented third term in November 1940, and he made explicit promises to American parents that their sons would not be sent into any foreign wars. Churchill heard these constraints as a political problem he had to work around carefully, not confrontationally. From the moment he became Prime Minister, Churchill began a correspondence with Roosevelt that would eventually total nearly 2,000 messages. He was careful, deliberate, sometimes theatrical in how he framed Britain's situation. He wanted to make clear that Britain was fighting not just for its own survival, but for the principles of democratic civilization that America also embodied. He wanted Roosevelt to feel viscerally that a Nazi-dominated Europe was an existential threat to America too. But Churchill was also painfully aware that he could not simply ask America to enter the war. That would be counterproductive. Americans resented being told what to do, and Churchill, as a half-American himself, his mother Jennie Jerome having come from New York, understood this instinctively. The approach had to be more subtle. Make the case, supply the arguments, let the Americans reach the conclusion themselves. Roosevelt was sympathetic, more than sympathetic. He was personally convinced that American involvement was probably inevitable. But the political constraints were real. He could go only as fast as public opinion would allow. The result was an unusual relationship. Roosevelt extended American support to Britain through means that tested the edges of neutrality. The Destroyers for Bases Agreement in September 1940 transferred 50 American destroyers to Britain in exchange for leases on British bases. Lend-Lease, passed by Congress in March 1941, allowed Britain to receive vast quantities of American war material without immediate payment. American naval vessels began escorting convoys partway across the Atlantic, and Roosevelt had issued shoot-on-sight orders against German submarines by mid-1941. The United States was, by late 1941, already engaged in undeclared naval hostilities with Germany in the Atlantic. But that was not the same as being at war. Churchill knew the difference. Lend-Lease kept Britain supplied. American naval presence helped protect the supply lines. None of it changed the fundamental calculation. Britain, with its empire, was fighting Germany and Italy more or less alone, with the Soviet Union as an unexpected and somewhat unreliable ally since June 1941, when Hitler launched Operation Barbarossa. Churchill's private communications during this period are sometimes agonizing to read. He maintained extraordinary public confidence that was both genuine temperament and deliberate political strategy. But in his private letters and in the accounts of those closest to him, there is a persistent undercurrent of anxiety about the same question. Would America come in? And if so, when? The year 1941 was brutal for Britain. The North African campaign went back and forth across the Libyan desert, with punishing losses on both sides. The Battle of the Atlantic was entering its most dangerous phase. German submarines were sinking Allied shipping at rates that threatened to strangle Britain's supply lines. In the Mediterranean, the Royal Navy suffered serious losses. In the Balkans, Germany swept through Yugoslavia and Greece, and British forces evacuated yet again. Churchill spent considerable energy in 1941 making the case to Roosevelt that Britain needed more than supplies. It needed a committed ally. He also spent energy managing Stalin, who had suddenly become a partner after Germany invaded the Soviet Union. The diplomatic juggling was extraordinary. In August 1941, Churchill and Roosevelt met in person for the first time since the war began, on warships anchored off Newfoundland at Placentia Bay. The meeting produced the Atlantic Charter, a joint declaration of war aims that was remarkable given that America was not technically at war. The Charter committed both nations to principles including self-determination, freedom of the seas, and the disarmament of aggressor nations after the conflict ended. Churchill came away from the Atlantic Charter meeting encouraged but not satisfied. Roosevelt was sympathetic, engaged, clearly invested in Britain's survival. But he still could not bring America into the war directly. The political constraints hadn't changed. What Churchill needed was an event, something that would cut through the political debate, that would make American neutrality feel not just wrong, but impossible. He could not manufacture such an event. He could only wait. Meanwhile, 1941 wore on. In October, the American destroyer USS Reuben James was sunk by German submarine U-552 in the Atlantic, killing more than 100 American sailors. America was already escorting convoys and had issued shoot-on-sight orders. It was, in practical terms, already in an undeclared naval conflict with Germany. There was outrage at the Reuben James sinking, but not enough to shift the political landscape decisively. Churchill watched all of this from Chequers and Downing Street, managing a global war, giving his speeches, writing his telegrams to Roosevelt, and waiting. The Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor was not, in the strategic sense, a surprise to Churchill or to most informed British officials. Relations between Japan and the United States had been deteriorating badly throughout 1941. Japan had invaded French Indochina, the United States had imposed an oil embargo, and negotiations in Washington had reached an impasse. Most British and American analysts believed that Japan would move militarily somewhere in the Pacific or Southeast Asia. The British had been particularly worried about Malaya and Singapore. What was not known, what no one had specifically anticipated, was the scale and audacity of the Pearl Harbor attack itself. Japan's carrier fleet had sailed across the Pacific in secrecy, maintained radio silence, and launched a strike that devastated the American Pacific Fleet on a quiet Sunday morning. The news began reaching London in the afternoon. Churchill was at Chequers, having dinner with Winnant and Harriman. Harriman's account of the moment has Churchill listening to the radio report with initial quiet, then a kind of deliberate composure. Churchill excused himself from the table. Churchill's own account in The Second World War describes his reaction in characteristic terms. He wrote that he went to bed and slept the sleep of the saved and thankful. It is important to note that Churchill wrote this years after the war, knowing the outcome, which likely amplified the sense of inevitability he expressed on the page. That line has been quoted extensively, sometimes with discomfort, because it reveals the extent to which Churchill experienced the Pearl Harbor attack, a catastrophic American military defeat that killed more than 2,400 people, primarily as a resolution to his strategic problem. This is not as callous as it might sound in isolation, but it does require context. Churchill had been carrying the weight of Britain's survival for 19 months. He had genuinely believed in certain dark moments that Britain might lose the war without American involvement. His relief was not pleasure at American suffering. It was the release of a specific, grinding anxiety that had defined his tenure as Prime Minister.
That same evening, he called Roosevelt. The president's voice, as Churchill recalled it, was tense and clipped. Roosevelt reportedly said, "It's quite true. They have attacked us at Pearl Harbor. We are all in the same boat now." Churchill told Roosevelt that Britain would move to declare war on Japan as soon as the attacks on British territories, Malaya was already under assault, Hong Kong would follow, could be formally confirmed to Parliament. Britain's declaration of war came the following day, December 8, driven not only by solidarity with America, but by the direct Japanese attacks on British possessions. The conversation was brief. Churchill returned to his guests. The atmosphere at Chequers that evening shifted from the sobriety of the dinner to something different. Not celebration exactly, but a sense of changed circumstance. Winnant, the American ambassador, described feeling the weight of what had just happened. Harriman was similarly subdued. Churchill was not subdued. He was energized. And he began almost immediately to think not just about Japan, but about Germany. Because the real question, the question that would determine whether the night of December 7th represented a true turning point or merely an expansion of the Pacific theater, was whether Germany and Italy would honor their tripartite pact with Japan and declare war on the United States. The tripartite pact committed Germany and Italy to come to Japan's defense if Japan were attacked by a power not already in the war. Since Japan had initiated hostilities at Pearl Harbor, Hitler was not legally obligated to respond. He could have stayed out of the wider conflict entirely and watched America pour its energy into the Pacific while Europe remained his. Churchill spent part of that Sunday night alert to exactly this possibility. If Germany did not declare war on America, the political dynamics might actually become more complicated. America might concentrate its attention and resources into the Pacific, leaving Britain and the Soviet Union to continue fighting Germany in Europe with only indirect American support. Hitler solved the problem himself. On December 11, 1941, 4 days after Pearl Harbor, he declared war on the United States from the Reichstag in Berlin. He declared it without broad consultation and without a fully developed long-term strategy for fighting a war simultaneously against Britain, the Soviet Union, and now America, though historians note he had been considering conflict with the United States as increasingly inevitable for some time, and believed the undeclared naval war in the Atlantic had already made the situation effectively hostile. Congress responded in kind the same day, which also removed Roosevelt's political burden of having to persuade Congress to expand the war to Europe. 4 days after Pearl Harbor, Hitler had done that for him. Historians have spent decades analyzing this decision. The most plausible explanations involve a combination of factors: Hitler's genuine contempt for America as a fighting power, his belief that the United States was already effectively at war with Germany in the Atlantic, his desire to give German U-boats unrestricted freedom to attack American shipping, and a significant miscalculation about how quickly America could mobilize and project power into Europe. Whatever the full reasoning, the decision was strategically catastrophic for Germany. Churchill, when he received the news, had now achieved what he had long believed was necessary for victory: full American entry into the war. The strategic picture had been transformed completely. Churchill moved quickly. Within days, he was on a ship to America for what would become the Arcadia Conference in Washington, the first major Allied conference of what was now a genuinely global war. He arrived on December 22, 1941, and stayed for 3 weeks. His goal at Arcadia was not simply to coordinate immediate military action. It was to establish the fundamental strategic framework for how the Allies would fight the war. Specifically, Churchill wanted to reinforce and press for the Europe First approach, the principle that defeating Germany should take priority over the Pacific War against Japan. American military planners, through pre-war Rainbow 5 strategic planning, had already begun developing this framework before Pearl Harbor. Churchill's role was not to invent it, but to champion it forcefully in the new political environment and make sure it held. This was not an obvious position for Americans in December 1941. The attack that had brought America into the war was Japanese. The public anger was directed at Japan. The instinct in much of the American military and among the American public was to strike back first against the country that had struck them. Churchill and Roosevelt together ensured this instinct did not override the longer strategic logic. Germany represented the greater threat, an industrial and military power in control of Europe that, if left unchallenged while America focused on the Pacific, could consolidate a position nearly impossible to dislodge. The Germany First strategy became Allied policy and remained so throughout the war. Among the witnesses to the events of December 7th at Chequers, John Winant left some of the most thoughtful reflections. He was a Republican, a former governor of New Hampshire, appointed ambassador partly because his political credentials made him credible across party lines in both countries. He had developed a genuine personal relationship with Churchill and with members of the British government. Winant's memoir describes the evening at Chequers with a restraint that is itself revealing. He noted that Churchill's response to the news was swift and purposeful rather than shocked or grief-stricken. Churchill understood immediately what it meant. He moved to action.
Winant, who had spent months as a kind of conduit between Churchill and an American political system that couldn't fully commit, seems to have felt in that moment both the relief that Churchill felt and something more complicated, an awareness of what the attack had cost in American lives and what it would cost in the years ahead. Winant later noted that Churchill had told him that evening something to the effect that Britain and America would now see the thing through together. He described Churchill's demeanor as resolute rather than triumphant, which may be the most accurate characterization of a man who had an extraordinary capacity to hold complexity, who could feel genuine relief at a strategic development while remaining clear-eyed about its human cost. There is also Harriman's account. Averell Harriman had been in London since March 1941 as Roosevelt's special envoy, administering Lend-Lease and generally serving as Roosevelt's eyes and ears in Britain. He had watched Churchill manage the war up close for months. His recollection of December 7th emphasizes Churchill's immediate focus on the future rather than the present, on what needed to happen next, on the calls that needed to be made, on the relationship with Roosevelt that now had a completely different foundation. These accounts together give a picture of Churchill on the evening of December 7th that is more nuanced than the famous "sleep of the saved and thankful" line suggests. He was relieved, he was energized, but he was also already thinking ahead, already managing, already working the next problem before the current one had fully registered. Churchill's description of sleeping the sleep of the saved and thankful has provoked considerable comment over the decades, and it deserves direct examination. The quote comes from his memoir, published after the war, so it carries the full weight of retrospect. Churchill wrote it knowing the Allies had won, knowing that American entry had been decisive, and knowing that the grand strategic arc of the conflict had vindicated his conviction that the alliance was necessary. He was writing partly as a statesman reflecting on history, and partly as a narrator shaping his own legacy. The line was deliberately chosen and deliberately literary. Writing it years later with the outcome known, Churchill's sense of inevitability was naturally sharper and more complete than anything he could have felt in real time on December 7, 1941. What the line captures genuinely is the scale of the relief. Churchill had been managing Britain's existential crisis for 19 months. He had presided over retreats and evacuations and catastrophic losses. He had given speeches designed to maintain national morale while privately understanding that the strategic picture was deeply uncertain. The arrival of America as a full belligerent partner did not guarantee victory, nothing could at that point, but it fundamentally changed the probability calculations in ways that Churchill had been working towards since May 1940. What the line somewhat obscures is the immediate complexity of what followed. Pearl Harbor did not immediately make Britain safe. The same week that Japan attacked America, Japanese forces began a devastating campaign against British Malaya that would end with the fall of Singapore, the largest surrender in British military history, in February 1942. Churchill's sense of relief at Pearl Harbor was followed almost immediately by some of the most painful military disasters of his tenure. He is recorded in various accounts as expressing the conviction that the war was now winnable, that the combined industrial and demographic weight of the United States, Britain, and the Soviet Union made a German victory effectively impossible in the long run, but in the long run still meant years of grinding, catastrophic fighting across multiple continents. The quote, in short, captures something true about Churchill's reaction, while necessarily reflecting the clarity that hindsight provides. He was not simply relieved and happy. He was relieved, and he was already beginning to think through the enormously complicated task of actually winning the war, now that the coalition existed to do it. Churchill arrived in Washington on December 22, 1941. He spent Christmas at the White House. On December 26th, he addressed a joint session of Congress, the first British Prime Minister to do so during the war. He opened with characteristic wit, telling Congress, "If my father had been American and my mother British instead of the other way round, I might have got here on my own." The line drew laughter and was calculated to draw laughter. Churchill understood American audiences, and he understood that humor could establish connection in ways that solemnity alone could not. He made the case for the Allied cause in terms that were simultaneously confident and realistic. He spoke of the long road ahead, of the fighting that remained, but framed it as a struggle that the combined forces of the democratic world were now capable of winning. The Arcadia Conference itself, running from December 22 to January 14, 1942, established the fundamental structures of the Allied war effort. The Combined Chiefs of Staff was created, a joint American-British military command body that would coordinate strategy for the duration of the war. The declaration by United Nations was signed on January 1, 1942, with 26 nations committing to the Atlantic Charter principles and pledging not to make separate peace with the Axis powers. Churchill worked extraordinarily hard during Arcadia. He held multiple meetings daily, drafted proposals, argued for strategic positions, and navigated the considerable frictions between British and American military thinking. He also, during this visit, had a health episode that his personal physician, Charles Wilson, later Lord Moran, believed may have been a minor cardiac event. Wilson chose not to tell Churchill at the time, judging that the critical negotiations underway made the timing of such a disclosure unwise. Wilson's diary account of this episode offers a striking window into the pressures Churchill was operating under. The Germany First strategy was confirmed. Allied command structures were established. The broad framework of how Britain and America would fight together had been settled. Churchill sailed back to Britain in January 1942, having consolidated what he came for. He had reinforced the Germany First strategic framework, established joint command structures, and positioned himself as a genuine partner to Roosevelt rather than a supplicant. The relationship between the two men now operated on a completely different footing. Churchill's memoirs are invaluable but not neutral. He was writing, as all memoirists do, with a perspective shaped by outcome and by the desire to present events in a particular light. His account of December 7 and the months that followed is compelling and broadly consistent with other sources, but it emphasizes his own clarity of vision and strategic foresight in ways that deserve some scrutiny. The actual British government records from this period, which have become available in the decades since, provide a more complicated picture. Churchill was clearer-eyed than most, but there were genuine disagreements within the British military and government about strategy. There were moments when the outcome was far less clear than Churchill's retrospective account suggests. The records of British intelligence, including those related to Ultra, the code-breaking operation at Bletchley Park, show that Churchill had access to significant intelligence about Axis military communications that informed his broader strategic judgments throughout the war. This general intelligence advantage is relevant context for understanding his apparent confidence at various points in the conflict. There is no evidence, however, that Ultra provided specific foreknowledge of the Pearl Harbor attack itself. On the specific question of his reaction to Pearl Harbor, the documentary record broadly supports his own account. The phone call to Roosevelt is confirmed from both sides. Britain's declaration of war against Japan on December 8 followed immediately after the attacks on British territories were formally established. His subsequent communications with Roosevelt and Stalin show a man operating from a newly confident strategic position, pressing hard for the command structures and strategic priorities he had long believed were necessary. What the documents also show is that Churchill did not take the American alliance for granted once it existed. He worked continuously to maintain it, to manage competing British and American strategic interests, and to navigate significant disagreements about North Africa, about the timing of the cross-channel invasion, about the relationship with the Soviet Union. The alliance that crystallized in December 1941 required constant diplomatic and political effort throughout the war. The relationship between Churchill and Roosevelt was one of the defining partnerships of the Second World War, built on words as much as anything else. The nearly 2,000 telegrams and messages they exchanged, the speeches each gave that shaped the other's political environment, the conversations at Placentia Bay and in Washington and at subsequent conferences. Churchill's oratory during the war served multiple audiences simultaneously. His British audience needed to hear confidence and resolve. His American audience needed to hear a cause worth fighting for, articulated in terms that connected with American values and American self-understanding. His Soviet ally needed to hear respect and partnership. His enemies needed to hear implacability. He was extraordinarily good at all of these registers, and he moved between them with facility. The speech to Congress in December 1941 is a clear example, pitched precisely to an American audience, using humor and directness and appeals to shared Anglo-American heritage, without being sycophantic or losing Churchill's essential character and weight. Words did not win the war. Industrial production, military strategy, the courage and sacrifice of soldiers and sailors and airmen, the suffering of civilian populations across the occupied world, these won the war. But words created the conditions in which the war could be won, by maintaining the will to fight, by building the alliances that made fighting possible, by articulating the stakes clearly enough that democratic societies would accept the costs. Churchill understood this more clearly than almost any other leader of his era. It is part of why December 7, 1941 mattered so profoundly to him, not just as a strategic development, but as a moment when the argument he had been making for 19 months finally had the full context and the full coalition behind it to become real. What Churchill said when he heard America had entered the war was shaped by everything that came before it. The relief he expressed was earned through 19 months of managing an impossible situation with inadequate resources. The clarity of his strategic vision in the days and weeks after Pearl Harbor came from 2 years of thinking carefully about exactly this scenario. He told Roosevelt that Britain would move to declare war on Japan once attacks on British territories were confirmed. He told Winston and Harriman that the alliance was now fully real. He told his memoir, written in the knowledge of victory, that he slept as a saved man. He told Congress that the democracies of the world, working together, would prevail. Each of these statements was true to something essential about his situation in December 1941.
The full picture is more complex than any single quote captures. Churchill was relieved and energized and already thinking ahead. He was also aware that the war was entering a new and in some ways more complicated phase, that managing an alliance with the world's largest industrial economy and a Soviet Union fighting for its survival would require constant work, that strategic disagreements would multiply, that the path to victory was still long and would cost more than anyone could accurately predict in December 1941. He knew all of that. He knew it on the evening of December 7th in the dining room at Chequers when the BBC broadcast confirmed what had happened at Pearl Harbor. And he set down his napkin and walked to the telephone. The conversation that followed, brief, clear, purposeful, was the beginning of something that had never existed before in quite this form. A full military alliance between Britain and the United States in a war that would determine the shape of the world for the next century. Churchill had spent 19 months working toward the conditions that made that phone call possible.
He made it in about 30 seconds. One detail from various accounts of that evening at Chequers deserves mention precisely because it has sometimes been embellished in popular tellings. Some versions describe champagne being opened, toasts being made, something like a celebration. The more reliable accounts, Winant's, Harriman's, and Churchill's own, suggest something more subdued. There was a sense of changed atmosphere, of weight lifted, but the evening was not a celebration. The men present were too aware of what had happened, of the American dead at Pearl Harbor, of the long road ahead, for anything as uncomplicated as celebration. No solid primary evidence supports the champagne version. Churchill's reaction was real. The relief was genuine. But it was the relief of a man who understood what the next years would cost, and who believed, with reason, that those costs could now actually lead somewhere, that the sacrifice would not be in vain, that the alliance now existed to see the thing through. He had said, in a different context, that he had nothing to offer but blood, toil, tears, and sweat. He understood in December 1941 that the blood and toil and tears and sweat of the years ahead were now shared, not Britain's alone to bear. That was what he had been working toward. That was what he felt on December 7th, 1941. The war would last 3.5 more years. The world would be transformed in ways that even Churchill's December relief could not fully anticipate. But the coalition that would win it was real now. Churchill had made his calls, confirmed his alliances, and gone to bed. Tomorrow there would be work to do. There always was.
This video is produced for historical education and documentary purposes. All information, quotes, and accounts are drawn from verified primary sources, including Churchill's published memoirs, first-hand testimonies by Averell Harriman and Ambassador John Winant, declassified archival records from the Churchill Archive and the Franklin D. Roosevelt Presidential Library, official parliamentary records via Hansard, and established academic historical scholarship. Roosevelt's reported words on the December 7th phone call are sourced from Churchill's memoir rather than a contemporaneous transcript and are presented as such. Historical interpretations may vary among scholars and historians. This video does not present interpretation as established fact and encourages viewers to consult the primary sources listed in this description for independent research.